By the time most people his age were content with crossword puzzles and afternoon naps, Walter Hayes had learned that the past does not always stay put. It lived in the shape of metal, in the feel of tumblers clicking into place, in the memory of heavy doors swinging open after years of being sealed. He had spent 3 decades of his life as the man banks, jewelers, and once or twice, less respectable clients called when a safe refused to cooperate. Then one bad night, one job with the wrong people and the wrong explanations, had stained his name just enough that the work dried up. No one proved he had done anything wrong, but suspicions have a way of leaving fingerprints. He stepped away from safes, took a job at a hardware store, and tried to make peace with aisles of paint cans and lawn tools instead of steel and combination dials. Retirement, when it finally came, was not the soft landing he had imagined. He and his wife Ruth lived in a small, tidy house at the edge of town, the sort with a porch swing that creaked in rhythm with the seasons. Their bills were paid, but just barely. There was food in the pantry, but no spare money for trips or little indulgences. A bad investment in a can't-miss retirement fund had taken a bite out of their savings years before, and the wound never quite healed. Ruth managed the budget with quiet discipline, stretching each check as far as it would go, mending clothes, cooking from scratch, making do. They weren't starving and they weren't complaining, but the margin between enough and not enough felt thinner every year. Walter still walked down to the hardware store twice a week to help out part-time, more for the sense of usefulness than the extra pay. The owner was glad to have him. Customers trusted a man with gray hair and careful eyes. Most days were ordinary, key copies, small talk, advice about door locks and squeaky hinges. But one Tuesday afternoon, as he straightened a display of padlocks, he overheard 2 younger men at the register talking in low, excited voices about one crazy storage auction score and a gun safe full of coins. He hadn't meant to listen, but the word safe was like a switch in his mind. He finished his shelf, then wandered closer under the excuse of wiping the counter, letting the pieces of their story find him. They talked about people who bought abandoned storage units and found all kinds of things inside: furniture, tools, collectibles, even cash. One of them mentioned that the best units were the ones that looked organized, not trashed, the ones where the boxes were packed with care. And if you ever see a big old safe shoved in the back, the man said, laughing, you bid until your wallet cries. There's always a reason someone locked something that heavy away. The words stayed with Walter long after the men left, walking out into the late afternoon sun without a second thought for the seed they had planted. That evening, over a simple dinner of soup and bread, he told Ruth about it. He didn't dramatize it, just repeated what he had heard and admitted that the idea of mystery behind a half-open storage door tugged at him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Ruth listened quietly, her hands folded around her mug, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepened by the kitchen light. She reminded him that they had no money to gamble. He agreed, but the thought did not go away. Later, when she fell asleep in her chair with the television murmuring, he opened the old laptop their grandson had set up for them and typed "storage auctions near me" into the search bar. The world that opened on the screen felt strange and familiar at once. There were lists of upcoming online auctions, photos of half-lit units, rules about payment and pickup, all laid out in plain text. He clicked through image after image. Mattresses slumped against walls, boxes sagging in corners, dusty bicycles, broken televisions. Most units looked like other people's headaches, not hidden treasure. But then he saw it. Lot #23B at North Ridge Self-Storage. The thumbnail was dark, the angle awkward, but his eye immediately caught on the shape in the back right corner. The unit itself looked ordinary enough. Plastic totes, a couple of wooden chairs, a lamp. Yet towering behind them, partly hidden under a heavy canvas drop cloth, was a squared-off bulk that made something in his chest tighten. He clicked the photo to enlarge it. The resolution was poor, but the bottom edge of the object was visible where the cloth didn't quite reach. He saw a corner of thick steel, painted a deep, old-fashioned green, with a decorative raised border, and just at the edge of shadow, the suggestion of an Art Deco scroll pattern. He knew the way a carpenter knows the grain of wood. On that border, barely visible through the graininess, was a small oval plate with a familiar curve along the top: Hayworth Security Works, Chicago. Walter had not thought about that name in years, but once, long ago, he had opened one of their vaults for a dying jeweler who had lost his combination. Those safes were not rare in their time, but they were built for serious owners. Banks, jewelers, wealthy families with more secrets than trust. They were also obscenely heavy. You did not put one in a storage unit by accident. He leaned closer, studying every pixel the old screen could offer. The profile of the door was thick. The hinges were external and ornate, indicating a model from the 50s or early 60s. No keypad, no electronic panel. This was a pure mechanical combination, the kind he understood best, the kind that spoke in clicks and resistance instead of beeps and error codes. The drop cloth draped over the top like someone trying to hide an elephant under a blanket. To anyone else it might have looked like an old refrigerator or cabinet. To Walter it was a safe saying, "I am here and you remember me." His first instinct was not greed but curiosity. Why would someone pay to store a safe like that when it was cheaper to scrap it than move it? Why cover it so clumsily? Why abandon the payments after years of steady checks? It felt wrong and compelling all at once, like hearing a half-finished confession. The listing information said only that the unit belonged to a delinquent account, no name, no history. The opening bid was higher than most, $1,200, but not impossible. Painful certainly. Reckless by their standards. Yet the number sat there on the screen daring him. He thought of Ruth. Thought of the envelope in the drawer where she kept their savings, folded and refolded around careful notes. Thought of how she always told their grandson that on the internet if you like something and want it to survive, you have to hit like, subscribe and leave a comment so the people behind it know it matters. The boy had laughed but she meant it. Support, she often said, is how good things stay alive, whether it's a little shop on Main Street or a story someone took the time to tell. That memory brushed across his mind now as he stared at the photograph of the half-hidden safe. In another life, he thought, if someone could like and subscribe to his instincts, this would be the moment to do it. He did not place a bid that night. Instead, he printed the listing and brought it to the kitchen table the next morning with the same seriousness he once reserved for loan papers and tax forms. Ruth read every line, studied the grainy photo, and listened as he explained what he saw in that shadowed corner. The old manufacturer plate, the style of the feet, the way the door seemed recessed. He admitted that his hands itched with the urge to touch the dial, to feel the tumblers again, to prove to himself that he still understood the language of locked steel. He did not hide the risk. If they lost the bid, nothing changed. If they won and the safe was empty, they would have sacrificed a portion of their security for nothing more than nostalgia and a story. Ruth sat in silence for a long time, the morning light drawing soft lines on her face. She had been beside him through the worst of the trouble when that one job with dishonest clients almost cost him his freedom, when the police questioned him more harshly than the men who had hired him. She knew how deeply he still blamed himself, not for the work, but for not listening to the small doubt in his own chest. At last she folded the paper neatly and slid it back to him. "We've spent a lifetime being careful," she said, voice low and steady. "And where has it left us? We manage but we don't live. If you truly believe this is something more than an old box of air, then we will be careful in a different way. We will decide together, and we will not lie to ourselves about why." The auction would be held online in 2 days, with the pickup window 48 hours afterward. Walter circled the date on their wall calendar, more solemnly than he had ever circled a doctor's appointment. He called the storage facility to confirm the details, his heart thudding when the manager mentioned casually that unit #23B had been scheduled for auction several times before, only to have the owner pay at the last minute and pull it from the list. This time there was no payment, the manager said. No call. No email. Nothing. It's like whoever it was just disappeared. The word hung between them through the crackling line. When he hung up, Walter stood for a long moment in the quiet kitchen, the weight of the choice ahead pressing into the old ache in his shoulders. He had not asked for another chance to deal with a safe that carried shadows. Yet here it was, wrapped in canvas in a darkened photo, waiting for someone to decide whether to leave the story closed or roll up the door and face whatever had been left behind. If the first part of their journey felt like a quiet shift in the air, the second unfolded like a slow-building storm. One of those strange, charged moments when something in the atmosphere tells you that life is preparing to change its shape. Harold and Margaret didn't rush toward that change. They approached it with the kind of steady, cautious determination that only comes with age and a lifetime of learning to survive what the world throws at you. But even caution can't drown out curiosity, and it was curiosity more than anything else that guided them the following morning as they sat at their small kitchen table, sipping coffee and staring at the glowing screen of an old laptop. The listing was still there, the same grainy photo, the same awkwardly clipped corner of a covered object, the same lingering sense that this was no ordinary unit. Now though, it felt less like a possibility and more like an invitation, one they couldn't ignore any longer. Margaret wasn't a woman easily swayed by impulse. She liked order, steady rhythms, the comfort of knowing what to expect. That's why Harold watched her closely as she studied the listing again and again, her brows tightening not with fear but with something more complex, recognition mixed with unease. She asked him if he was certain about that strange feeling he'd had, The sense that he knew what he was looking at despite only seeing a shadowed corner beneath the old tarp. He didn't try to convince her with grand statements. He simply told her the truth, that sometimes a man who has spent decades opening what others wanted to keep sealed can recognize a thing not by sight, but by presence. And this unit had presence. She didn't fully understand what that meant, but she trusted the weight of his words. She always had. The bidding started just before noon, and for the first few minutes they simply watched the numbers move on the screen. They hadn't intended to jump into the fray immediately. Their plan was to observe, wait for a safe moment, and only then decide whether to place a bid. But the longer they watched, the clearer it became that something unusual was happening. Very few people bid at all. In fact, most withdrew almost as soon as the auction began, as if the unit carried a reputation they already understood and wanted no part of. A single user kept raising the number by small increments, always from behind a blank, generic username with no profile photo and no bidding history. It was the kind of account that felt like a mask, made not to hide a person's identity but to hide their intentions. Then, without warning, the masked bidder stopped. Not slowly. Not at a natural break in the number. One moment they were raising the price, and the next the username vanished from the list entirely, as if someone had ripped a plug out of the wall. The countdown resumed, dropping 1 second after another in tight, deliberate rhythm. Margaret felt something twist inside her chest. Harold leaned forward, jaw set. At 3 seconds remaining, with no plan and no time for hesitation, he hit the bid button. The number turned blue. The timer froze. A small line of text appeared at the top of the screen. You are the highest bidder. Moments later, another line surfaced beneath it. Auction 1. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply sat there, staring at the screen, aware that something enormous had just shifted. It was a different kind of gravity, the kind that doesn't pull you down but forward. The storage facility sat 2 towns over. A wide, low building with metal roll-up doors and long stretches of gravel that crunched beneath the tires as they drove in. The young man at the office counter greeted them warmly, though his friendliness dimmed the moment he saw the unit number printed on the paper Harold handed him. His smile faltered just briefly in a way that people notice without acknowledging. He pointed them toward the farthest row, explaining that their unit was at the very end, tucked into the one corner the cameras never reached. He said this as if it were a harmless detail, but his tone carried an unspoken warning, a quiet admission that he didn't fully trust that corner himself. As they walked down the row, the young employee hurried after them and lowered his voice. He told them, in the careful tone of someone sharing something he wasn't sure he should say, that the previous renter had paid on time every single month for nearly 2 years. But always in cash, always in person, always wearing a hood so low that the cameras couldn't capture his face. Several employees remembered him slipping in toward closing time, unlocking the unit, and disappearing inside for long stretches. None of them knew what he did in there, but one thing stuck with all of them. On more than one occasion they heard the sound of heavy bolts turning and metal shifting, sounds no ordinary storage unit should ever produce. Margaret listened without blinking, and Harold's breath grew just slightly deeper. The employee continued, explaining that the reason no one recognized the object in the listing photo was because, years back, when the unit had first been rented, one of the older workers, now long retired, had spoken about a delivery so large the crew had to partially dismantle one of the loading gates to bring it inside. Whatever was in that unit, it hadn't arrived by accident. It had been placed with intention. And then they reached the door. It looked no different from the others. Same faded blue paint, same rusted latch, same humming metal tracks. But the air around it felt still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The employee unlocked the padlock and stepped aside, giving Harold the latch with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Harold lifted the door slowly. Dust drifted. Light filtered in. And there, emerging from the dimness like a sleeping animal, stood a massive object draped beneath a thick, faded canvas. Even covered, its outline was unmistakable to him, not because he saw it but because he'd spent half his lifetime working on the very shape hidden beneath. Margaret placed a hand over her heart, stunned by the sheer size of it. The employee whispered, "That's the thing we kept hearing. We all thought it was some kind of machinery. But now that I see it, it looks like one of those old vault safes. The kind you can't just call a locksmith for." Harold said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a voice steady enough to make both of them turn toward him, he murmured, "It's not just any safe. I know exactly what model that is." And the deeper he stared into the dimness, the more he realized that this discovery, this silent giant hiding beneath canvas, was about to pull them into a story much bigger than a simple storage auction. Harold didn't rush toward the canvas. For a long moment he simply stood there with Margaret and the young employee at his side, letting his eyes adjust to the dim space and the outline of that massive shape. The tarp was thick, stained in places where dust and time had settled, weighted along the bottom as if someone had wanted to be absolutely certain it would never slip and reveal what lay beneath. When he finally reached out, his fingers moved with a care that belonged less to an old habit of breaking in and more to a new respect for what might happen once this particular secret chose to show itself. He lifted one corner, slow and deliberate, and the smell that drifted out was familiar in a way that tugged at old memories, a mix of steel, oil, and the dry dust that always seems to gather where money and time have once shared the same room. As the canvas slid back, the object came into focus, an enormous, upright vault safe, its surface a dull, worn green with a thin gold pinstripe border and a manufacturer's name in raised letters across the front. The round combination dial sat in the center like a single, sightless eye, and the heavy handle below it looked as though it might remember every pair of hands that had ever turned it. Margaret drew in a quiet breath, not from fear but from awe at its sheer size. This wasn't the kind of safe a person bought for a home office or tucked into a closet. It was the kind that once anchored the back wall of a bank, a silent promise that whatever went inside would not come out easily. The young employee shifted his weight, suddenly less talkative now that the thing they'd all whispered about stood exposed in the light. He admitted, with a nervous half-smile, that the staff had often wondered how such a monster had been moved in at all. One of the older workers, long since retired, had told stories about the day it arrived, how a crew with a special rig had come before dawn, how the main gate had been partially dismantled, how the truck's suspension had groaned under the weight. "We always figured whoever rented this unit had deeper reasons than extra Christmas decorations," the young man said quietly, and the truth of that seemed to settle on all three of them at once. He added that if they wanted it opened the normal way, they'd likely have to pay a specialist more than the unit itself had cost. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned again that no camera in the facility quite covered this far corner, as if the building itself had been helping someone keep their secrets. For Harold, the sight of the safe did something no doctor, no pill, no polite reassurance had managed in years. It woke up an old part of his mind that had been lying quietly in the background, waiting for a job it knew how to do. He stepped closer, tracing the faded logo with his eyes. It was an older model from a line he'd worked on back when companies still prided themselves on making vaults meant to last 50 years instead of 5. He could see the details only someone like him would notice. The spacing of the bolts implied behind the door, the particular style of the dial's numbering, the hairline scratches of past combinations spun in long-ago rooms. Margaret watched him carefully, seeing not the man bent slightly with age, but the younger version of him she remembered, alert, precise, alert to every small sound. The years had curved his shoulders and thinned his hair, but they hadn't erased the quiet skill that had once nearly cost him his freedom. That skill was part of why he'd sworn off safes when the job that went wrong left his name in a file and his stomach sick for months. Yet here one stood, not as a temptation toward crime, but as something that now belonged to them under the dull, solid terms of an auction contract. The employee eventually left them alone, after asking gently whether they were sure they were all right on their own. Harold assured him they would just be looking and making a plan for later. Once the footsteps faded and the echo of the metal doors down the row settled into a distant hum, the storage unit felt different, less like a business space and more like a room someone had abandoned mid-thought. The safe dominated the back wall, but the rest of the unit told its own story. To the left, a narrow folding cot leaned against the wall, a thin blanket still rolled at one end as if waiting for the next shift. Nearby stood a small metal desk with one drawer slightly ajar, a stained mug sitting empty on top and a cheap plastic lamp without a bulb beside it. On the floor, 3 sturdy plastic containers held nothing glamorous, bottled water, canned soup, packets of instant coffee, but together they suggested that whoever had used this space hadn't just stored objects here. For a while he had almost lived with them. They started with the ordinary clutter, because that felt safer than marching straight toward the vault. Margaret opened the desk drawers while Harold sorted through the plastic bins, both of them moving methodically, not wanting to disturb more than they had to. Inside the desk, she found a stack of receipts paid in cash, all from the same hardware store, along with a few notebooks filled with cramped writing, dates, amounts, short notes that meant little out of context. Harold found only practical things in the bins, but their arrangement spoke of a mind that liked control. Labels facing outward, expiration dates penciled neatly across the tops. There was no wallet, no driver's license, no photograph of a family. It was as if the man who had used this unit had done everything possible to keep his identity separate from the place where he kept his secrets. For Harold and Margaret, this mix of precision and absence did not make them feel safer. It underscored that they were standing in the middle of someone else's unfinished plan. As they worked, the strangeness of it all pressed in gently but persistently. They had come for the simple thrill of a storage auction, hoping perhaps for a bit of valuable furniture or a collection of something they could sell to make life easier. Instead, they had found a safe large enough to hold every regret the previous owner might have wanted to hide. Yet alongside the unease, another feeling grew quietly, something like purpose. As odd as it was, this situation gave Harold a chance to use what he knew for something other than regret. Margaret could see that, and it softened the knot of worry in her chest. She knew that other people might see their interest in these stories as foolish or reckless, but she also knew that for people their age, listening to what happened when ordinary folks stumbled into old secrets had become a small comfort. In the same way that some viewers feel they're helping keep more real stories alive when they tap a like or subscribe button online, Harold and Margaret felt, in their own way, that taking care with what they'd found honored all the people who never got the chance to finish their own. Eventually, there was nothing left in the unit to open except the safe itself. The tarp lay folded near the door, the floor swept as best they could with a borrowed broom, the smaller containers stacked neatly for later. Harold stood in front of the safe with his hands resting lightly on his thighs, measuring his breath. He explained, more for Margaret's reassurance than his own, that technically they were not doing anything wrong by trying to open it. The unit, the safe, and everything in it had passed to them through a legal process as old as unpaid rent. If they hired a stranger to drill it, the result would be the same, only noisier and more expensive. Still, he approached it not with a sense of entitlement, but with a sense of stewardship. He had learned in his younger years that the difference between stealing and solving is not just who owns the lock, but what you intend to do with what's inside. He knelt on an old moving blanket, easing his knees down carefully, and pressed his ear near the metal just beside the dial. The surface was cool, the paint slightly rough under his fingertips where time had nicked it. He turned the dial gently at first, feeling the familiar drag of weight behind its face. The internal wheels had stiffened from disuse, but they still moved. He spun the dial through full rotations, listening for what those in his former profession had always called the music. The faint, layered series of clicks and soft stops that told an experienced ear where the inner discs might be lining up. At first, all he heard was the roar of his own pulse and the distant rattle of another unit being opened somewhere down the row. Twice he thought he felt something different, but when he tested the handle, it refused to budge. His shoulders sagged slightly. He was out of practice, and old skills do not return overnight simply because you want them to. Margaret watched him with a mix of worry and quiet pride. She didn't like seeing him strain or hold his breath too long, but she also knew this work steadied him in a way grief and small routines never had. She suggested gently that they not push too hard on the first day. There was no need to prove anything, not to her and certainly not to the safe. If they had to call in a professional later, they would. Pride was a poor substitute for health. Reluctantly, he agreed, standing slowly and stretching his back. They locked the unit, made sure the new combination on the outer door worked properly, and drove home in that familiar, careful silence couples develop when they both know there is more to say, but both trust that the conversation will be waiting for them when they are ready. That night, Harold lay awake longer than usual, his mind replaying the subtle resistances he had felt in the dial. Combinations for that safe model usually followed certain patterns, built from numbers that mattered to the owner, birthdays, badge numbers, addresses, or sometimes from simple habits like counting by fives. He remembered a few tricks he had used decades ago, the way listening to 3 wheels instead of 4 could narrow the field, the way a careful hand could note the tiny shifts where most people heard only noise. He rose once to jot a few sequences on a notepad by the bed, then slipped back under the covers, listening to the soft breathing of the woman who had weathered every storm with him, including the one his old work had nearly unleashed. The next morning they returned to the unit with a thermos of coffee, a cushion for his knees, and a sense of quiet determination. The facility was less busy midweek. Fewer metal doors banged open, fewer voices carried down the long corridor. Harold took his position again, but this time he approached the work differently. Instead of spinning at random, he tried a series of deliberate combinations drawn from the notes they had found. Certain dates in the notebook, numbers that appeared more than once in the receipts, patterns that might have meant something to the man who had lived half his life in the shadows of this safe. Between each attempt, he listened, really listened, to the way the inner parts settled or resisted. The hours stretched, but the work, unlike so many other tasks of aging, did not feel like time wasted. It felt like time applied. At one point, Margaret suggested a break, and they stepped out into the pale afternoon light to drink lukewarm coffee and share a sandwich in the car. They did not discuss what they hoped to find. They talked instead about practical things, what repairs the house needed, how they would feel safer with a better car, how nice it would be to help their granddaughter with college someday. They didn't dream in wild numbers or lottery fantasies. They spoke in modest, steady wishes, the kind that people who have known scarcity their whole lives carry like small lanterns. Then they went back inside because some doors will not open for you unless you show that you are willing to return. Near the end of the day, when Harold's shoulders ached and his patience had worn down to something thin but still intact, he tried one more sequence, this time using a number from a small, worn sticker half hidden along the base of the safe. It was the serial, the kind of detail customers never noticed but service technicians always did. He wove part of that number together with a date, spun the dial through its slow, deliberate turns, and then stopped. The sound that followed was not dramatic. It was a soft, deep click from somewhere inside the door, different from every hesitant noise he had heard before. When he wrapped his hand around the heavy handle and leaned his weight into it, the resistance he had come to expect melted away. The metal moved, grudging but yielding, and the seal that had held for years broke with a low sigh that seemed almost like breath. The vault safe was no longer locked. And as the door began to swing inward on its thick hinges, Harold and Margaret understood that whatever waited in the dark beyond that steel edge was about to change not just their finances, but the way the world looked to them when they woke up each morning. By the time the safe door stood fully open, the storage unit no longer felt like a concrete box at the back of a lot. It felt like a crossroads. The retired couple stood shoulder to shoulder in the thin strip of light that fell from the open roll-up door, looking into a metal room inside a metal room, and both understood that whatever lay on those shelves was going to tilt their quiet life one way or another. The first impressions had already been unsettling enough. Neat bundles of cash in rubber bands that had browned with age, a leather ledger written in a disciplined hand, a compact pistol wrapped in oiled cloth, and near the back of the deepest shelf, a small black phone that looked too old to matter and too deliberate to ignore. The outer unit still smelled of dust and motor oil, but inside the safe there was another smell entirely, the faint mingled trace of paper, gun oil, and the cold iron patience of secrets that had been waiting a long time to be found. Harold had spent his younger years opening safes under fluorescent light for banks and insurance companies, never once touching anything but the mechanism and the signature line, yet even to him this arrangement felt wrong. The cash was not stacked like savings, it was organized like inventory. The ledger did not read like a household budget. It read like a record kept by someone who expected every column to be examined one day in a courtroom or a back room, depending on how the story turned. Some entries were marked only with initials and dates, others with amounts and heavy figures that made him quietly adjust his sense of scale. Louise moved more slowly, gloved hands careful on every item, heart torn between gratitude and alarm. She knew that money could fix a great many things they had learned to live without, but she also knew that money with a past tends to drag its history along with it. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, cataloging each shelf the way Harold had once trained new technicians to document every tumbling pin and dial plate. The top shelf held almost nothing but paper, manila folders filled with photocopies of reports, some bearing departmental seals, others carrying logos from agencies they recognized only from news stories. Certain lines had been blacked out with a heavy marker, yet the remaining text hinted at internal investigations and evidence logs that were never meant to leave official buildings. Beneath those folders lay a small velvet box containing a watch whose face Harold recognized from magazine ads but had never seen in person, the sort of piece bought by men who liked time to announce their status. Another shelf yielded a shallow tin of coins and clear plastic capsules, each with a typed label and a valuation from a Scottsdale dealer dated more than a decade earlier. None of it looked accidental. All of it looked like it had been taken out of one system and preserved carefully in another, as if the safe itself were a private archive for somebody who no longer trusted institutions to hold his leverage. Only when they reached the inner compartment at the very back did the tone of their discovery shift again. The compartment was secured by a secondary key lock, badly scarred around the edges from past attempts to change it, and for a moment Harold felt the old professional frustration rise in his chest. His first two tries at manipulation failed, his fingers clumsy from years spent handling nothing more delicate than grocery cartons. On the third attempt he forced himself to breathe the way he had taught himself as a young man, slow and even, listening more to the faint feedback under his fingertips than to his own doubt. When the bolt finally slid back with a soft metallic sigh, Louise actually flinched. Inside lay a narrow metal box the length of his forearm, unmarked on the outside, heavier than its size suggested. They set it on a moving blanket and opened it together, bracing themselves without knowing exactly for what. The contents were not dramatic in appearance, yet they rearranged the air. There were 3 passports with the same photograph and 3 different names, all stamped with entries into countries better known from headlines than travel brochures. There was a plastic evidence bag containing a tiny digital recorder and a separate bag holding a wired button microphone of the sort worn under a shirt. There was a second ledger, smaller and more crowded than the first, its pages full of dates paired with phrases like meeting, warehouse, drop, north lot, and cash out, no record. Tucked into the back cover was a single sheet of hotel stationery, bearing just one sentence in block letters. Not now. Not yet. Beside the ledgers lay another bundle of cash, this one tighter, newer, and large enough that Louise's breath caught even before she counted the bands. The old phone, which they had set aside earlier, suddenly seemed less like a relic and more like a missing piece. By the time they loaded the contents of the safe into their car, papers in plastic bins, cash and valuables sealed in discreet boxes beneath a folded blanket, the sun had already slipped low, turning the storage yard into a grid of long blue shadows and harsh white highlights. The facility manager, walking past with a clipboard under his arm, paused just long enough to remark that it was a wonder they had gotten the safe open at all. Most folks, he said, would have just called a professional and watched from a distance. Harold only nodded, not ready to explain that once upon a time, he had been the man in the van who arrived with a toolbox and a non-disclosure agreement. As they drove home, the highway lights seemed brighter than usual, each one flashing briefly across the boxes stacked in the rear like a camera taking evidence shots. At the kitchen table that evening they spread everything out in careful batches, replacing the unit's dust with their own lamplight. The numbers were frightening in their size. Cash alone that, at a quick count, ran well into the low six figures, plus coins and a watch that would almost certainly fetch more than either of them had ever earned in a year. Yet the things that held their attention longest were not the bills or the jewelry but the ledgers and photocopied reports. There were recognizable badge numbers and case names, alongside references to informal fees and off-book reimbursements, that charted a quiet parallel economy inside some department whose patch Harold could almost picture in his mind. It was, in a way, a map of how one man had stepped off the straight path and started walking a narrower, more profitable line between official authority and unofficial arrangements, the kind of path that usually ends abruptly. Somewhere in the middle of that first long night of sorting, a simple, unnerving truth settled over them. They were not looking at a random stash forgotten by a careless criminal. They were looking at a retired policeman's shadow life, hidden in a unit placed deliberately where cameras did not reach, in a safe so heavy it required disassembling a doorway to install. That meant that somewhere years back decisions had been made about what to steal, what to keep, what to hide, and what to hold in reserve in case someone ever needed persuading or silencing. They had not just inherited money, they had stumbled into the center of a story that had once been dangerous enough to bury under steel. For a moment Louise imagined what their quiet neighbors would say if they ever heard the tale. In another world, it would make the kind of small-town segment that people forwarded to one another with raised eyebrows, the kind that made folks murmur that if such a thing ever happened to them, they would do the noble, obvious thing. People at home would sip coffee, press a little heart icon, maybe tap a button to hear how it all ended, then leave long comments about what they would or would not have done in the same situation, safely at a distance. The thought made her half smile and half shiver, because there is a wide river between imagining a choice and living with one. They decided that first night to sleep on it before taking any steps, but sleep did not come easily. Every time Harold closed his eyes, he saw the old safe's thick door swinging inward, revealing not treasure but obligation. Every time Louise drifted off, some faint noise, a car door on the street, the distant rise and fall of a siren, jerked her back up with her heart pounding. The phone they had found lay powered off in a ceramic bowl on the counter, as if distance from metal could make it less real. An hour past midnight, unable to bear the silence, Harold rose and walked to the window. On most nights their street was an unremarkable ribbon of asphalt bordered by modest lawns and the occasional porch light. Tonight a dark sedan was parked farther down the block than most guests chose to stop, engine off, windows dull in the sodium glow. It could have been anyone's car. It could have been nothing. Yet he watched it for a full 10 minutes, counting his breaths, until it started without its lights and rolled away. In the pale light of morning, practical questions marched back in. Whatever they chose to do, they needed to know what they were holding, not just in terms of danger but in terms of value and law. The safest first step, they agreed, was to have the watch and coins examined discreetly, without mentioning the ledgers or the cash. A shop on the edge of town specialized in estate jewelry and old coinage, the sort of place where counter staff still used loupes more than calculators. Harold wrapped the pieces in an old handkerchief, left the rest locked in their newly bolted closet safe at home, and drove out with Louise beside him, both of them quieter than usual. The appraiser at the shop took his time, the way people do when something genuinely interests them. He weighed the coins, checked mint marks and conditions, and whistled softly under his breath when he saw the watch's movement through its open back. When he finally wrote numbers on his pad, they were far higher than either Harold or Louise had dared guess, yet even then he frowned as if something did not sit right. He offered a figure to buy them outright, a sum that would once have seemed outrageous and now felt oddly like a first bid instead of an honest price. Harold thanked him, said he needed time to think, and slid the handkerchief back into his pocket. Only in the parking lot, under the bleach of midday sun, did the next strange piece fall into place. A man who had been inside the shop while they were there, a middle-aged customer, apparently occupied with a tray of old bills, appeared beside their car before Harold could start the engine. He did not lean in or raise his voice. He simply spoke through the open window, eyes steady but not unkind, telling them quietly that the offer they had just received was less than half of what those pieces would bring at a proper sale. He said, still in that low, professional tone, that items like theirs did not drift in from yard sales and that there were people who made a living buying panic for pennies on the dollar. Before they could do more than nod, he had pressed a plain business card into Harold's hand, one with nothing but a name, a phone number, and the word auctions printed in spare letters, then walked away as if he had never stopped. On the drive home, the old phone in the ceramic bowl began to ring, its vibration rattling faintly against the dish like a trapped insect. Both of them stared at it for a full 3 rings, neither wanting to see the caller ID. On the 4th, Harold picked it up and, with the same careful calm he had once used when answering after-hours bank calls, said hello. The voice on the other end was male, not young, and so controlled it almost sounded hollow. It did not announce a name, did not ask who was speaking. It simply said that the safe was not theirs to open, that the contents were not theirs to keep, and that there were people who had gone to considerable trouble to see that what lay inside remained unseen. The caller did not shout or swear. He gave the impression of someone reading a script that had been written years earlier, for a contingency everyone hoped would never occur. When Harold asked how the man had this number, the line went quiet for a moment, then the voice replied that the safe did not move without certain people knowing. It advised them, in language that never quite crossed the line into explicit threat, to return everything as quietly as they had found it, to walk away, to forget what they had seen. Then the call ended with a click that sounded far louder than it should have in their small kitchen. For a long time neither of them spoke. The bowl sat on the counter, the phone dark again, like a stone that had just skipped once across deep water and vanished. That evening, after the first edge of fear dulled into something more usable, Harold spread their notes across the table again. The ledgers did not just hold amounts. They held dates and initials that matched badges and case numbers from the photocopied reports. The presence of the disguised phone and the recording equipment suggested that at some point their unknown predecessor had been either cooperating with investigators or building his own insurance policy against colleagues and criminals alike. The coins and watch and cash looked, on the surface, like the fruits of corruption, yet the pattern of the entries hinted that some of it might have been seized from those even less innocent than the officer who had stored it. That did not make it pure. It did, however, make the situation far too complex to solve alone. They agreed on one thing as the house finally grew quiet. Whatever else happened, their choices could not be driven entirely by fear, nor entirely by the sudden knowledge that they might, for the first time in their lives, be able to pay every bill without counting and recounting. If they treated what they had found as simple winnings, they would become another link in a chain that had already done harm. If they handed everything to the first authority that demanded it, they risked seeing the truth disappear into the same shadows that had sheltered it for years. Somewhere between those extremes lay a road that would allow them to keep enough to change their lives honestly and still bring some measure of light to a story that had been kept in the dark too long. Outside, the street looked ordinary again, with only the soft glow of porch lights and the occasional passing car marking the hours. Inside, 2 people who had never asked for an adventure sat at a worn wooden table, surrounded by evidence that the past had not finished speaking yet. The safe in the storage unit had been built to withstand fire and attack. The one in their dining room now had to withstand temptation and fear. Before they went to bed, Harold took the plain auctioneer's card from his wallet and set it next to the ledger, then placed the old phone on top of both, as if weighing down 3 possible futures with the same piece of plastic and glass. In the morning, he told himself, they would start choosing which doors to open next, and which to close firmly behind them. When dawn finally broke, its pale light spilled across the couple's small kitchen like a quiet reminder that night, no matter how threatening, always ends. Walter stood with his hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, watching dust shimmer in the sunbeam as if waiting for some final verdict from the universe. Margaret, who had not slept more than an hour, sat across from him sorting the documents they had rescued from the safe into neat, careful piles. The previous evening's terror still clung to the walls, but with morning came a decision neither had voiced aloud until now. Fear could not be the one steering their lives. Not anymore. They were tired of being at the mercy of strangers, tired of seeing opportunity only as a risk rather than as a doorway. After everything they'd survived, Walter's wrongful arrest years ago, Margaret's long shifts cleaning offices just to keep the lights on, the months when even groceries felt like a negotiation, they understood something new. This wasn't just a storage unit. This was closure. Maybe even redemption. Their first stop that morning was a different pawn shop, one Walter remembered from his locksmithing days. It was run by a soft-spoken man named Everett who had once hired Walter to open a jammed antique vault for an estate sale. Everett greeted them with the kind of recognition that softens a room, and after listening to their story in quiet disbelief, he examined the gold coins with a seriousness that instantly reassured them. He checked weights, mint marks, microscopic scratches, verifying authenticity with the slow, respectful motions of a man who still believed craftsmanship mattered. When he finished, he looked up, slid his glasses into their case, and named a number that made Margaret's breath catch. It was more than double what the first pawn shop had offered. And when Everett moved on to the vintage watch, he simply whispered, "This alone could fund a comfortable retirement." The relief that washed over Walter felt like a tide finally receding after years of storms. But Everett did one more thing, something neither of them expected. He carefully closed the folders of sensitive documents from the safe, pushed them gently toward Walter and said, "Whatever you do with these, choose the path that lets you sleep at night." There was no judgment, no pressure, just the wisdom of a man who had seen too many lives break under the weight of secrets. And with that, they knew exactly what they would do. On the way home, they drove to the sheriff's substation, walked inside hand in hand, and turned in the binders and false passports anonymously. They didn't want rewards, they didn't want complications, they wanted peace. And sometimes peace is simply doing the right thing without waiting for applause. Within a week, the coins and watch went through a legitimate appraisal network and then, per Everett's recommendation, into a private auction catalog. The bids climbed slowly at first, then surged in the final hour, ending with a figure that left Walter and Margaret staring at the screen in stunned silence. $348,000. Enough to pay off their lingering debts. Enough to repair the roof that had leaked for 3 winters. Enough to give them back the life they had quietly talked themselves out of for years. When the wire transfer finally landed, Margaret sat at the dining table and cried, not out of greed or shock but out of profound relief. She had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without doing math in her head. With their newfound stability came decisions that were gentle rather than grand. Walter reopened a tiny workshop in their garage, a retirement hobby, on paper but a return to a craft that had once given him pride. Customers soon learned that the old man who sharpened blades and repaired locks in that garage worked with the care of someone who valued trust more than money. Margaret, meanwhile, bought a second-hand upright piano, the one indulgence she had denied herself for decades, and filled their evenings with the soft, unsure melodies of a beginner rediscovering joy. Their house, which for years had felt like a place of waiting, slowly became a place of living again. 2 months later, on a breezy spring afternoon, they drove back to the storage facility with a box of pastries for the staff as a quiet thank you. The young attendant who'd first told them about the mysterious visitor recognized them instantly and hurried over, eager for an update. When he heard that they had managed to open the safe themselves, he shook his head in disbelief. "You know," he said, "we all figured whatever was in there would cause trouble." Walter smiled softly and replied, "Sometimes trouble is just the beginning of a chance." It was the closest he came to telling the truth, that courage isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply a man and a woman choosing not to walk away from something frightening because they feel, deep down, that it was meant for them. But the strangest part of the entire ordeal happened quietly, weeks after the sale. The phone from the safe, the same one that had lit up in the darkness, the same one that had carried the anonymous warning, never rang again. One afternoon, Walter powered it on out of curiosity. No messages. No missed calls. No signal in the call log. It was as if that single conversation had been a last gasp of a dying secret. And then, like all things that lose their purpose, it simply disappeared into silence. Whatever man had once crouched in that unit, hunched over that safe in a hooded jacket, was long gone. And whatever he feared people discovering, no longer had teeth. In time, the terror faded into something almost tender, a reminder of how fragile and unexpected second chances can be. Walter and Margaret used part of their money to travel for the first time in their lives, visiting the Maine coast they had always dreamed about. They walked hand in hand along the shoreline, listening to gulls and waves, feeling decades of worry begin to lift like mist above the water. And every so often, Margaret would squeeze Walter's hand and say, "Can you believe all this started with a dusty storage unit and a bit of old canvas?" And Walter would smile because the truth, the real truth, was that it hadn't started there at all. It had started the moment they chose hope over fear, curiosity over caution, life over shrinking. If their story had a moral, it was simple but powerful. Sometimes the universe hides blessings inside the very things that scare us. And the people who find them aren't the lucky ones, they're the ones who dare to open the door anyway. Walter and Margaret had spent years believing their best days were behind them. But a forgotten safe, a risk taken late in life, and a little courage proved that new beginnings don't check your age before arriving. They simply wait for the moment you're brave enough to claim them. And so, in the soft golden light of their new life, the retired couple finally understood what the old saying really meant. Fortune favors the bold, but peace favors the honest. They had been both. And because of that, their future, once small and uncertain, had opened wider than they ever imagined, like a vault finally giving way after years of silence.